You're overreacting. That's what he said. Just 3 nights ago. He stood right there. Same dark blazer. Same smug half smile. And now, he's about to sell the company we built. Without my name in the paperwork. My fingers tightened around the flash drive. Tiny thing, ugly beige plastic. But inside, everything. His voice, his plan, his lie. The investors didn't look at me. Not yet. They stared at Greg. Charming, polished Greg. Mr. I wear the vision hat. He was pitching like nothing ever happened. I counted his words. We've grown fast, he said. My team made it possible. My team, huh? He clicked to the next slide. The cap table. My name? Nowhere. Just founding technical support. Support. My stomach turned. 3 years of patents. Frozen warehouses. Nights printing prototypes at FedEx. Support. Greg's voice dropped a little. He glanced my way. Just enough to sting. Janelle was great early on, but she's not involved in the current strategy. Not involved. I leaned forward. The lead investor crossed his arms. Are there any IP concerns? He asked. Greg shrugged. All proprietary systems are under my name. We've handled that cleanly. Nope, you didn't. I reached into my bag. Slid the flash drive across the table. The room went still. Greg blinked. Forced a chuckle. What's this? I looked at him. Straight. Receipts? I said. Would you like to hear your own voice, Greg? No one moved. Someone coughed. The AC hummed. That was it. I clicked play. His voice filled the room. Clear, smug, recorded. She doesn't matter anymore. We'll quietly remove her after the deal. No one needs to know. Say pause. Dead silence. Then the lead investor looked at me. Then at Greg. He stood up slowly. Greg didn't blink. Greg, he said. Would you like to explain that? I leaned back. Heart racing. But steady. You said I was overreacting, I whispered. Turns out, I was just recording. The first office didn't even have walls, just plywood panels and a heater that rattled when you looked at it wrong. We rented it for $400 a month. Split the cost. Greg brought his polished pitch deck. I brought a soldering iron and 5 rolls of duct tape. That winter in Salt Lake hit hard. Ice crusted the windows every morning. I wore 2 pairs of socks and brewed weak coffee from the old Mr. Coffee we found in the back closet. It smelled like burnt plastic and cinnamon. Greg laughed when I labeled our first test unit, W. Zalazar 1. Feels too military, he said. I shrugged. Muscle memory. He didn't ask. Not then. Didn't ask about my 10 years in Air Force logistics. Didn't ask what it felt like packing gear in Afghanistan, knowing a broken sensor could cost lives. That was fine. Not everyone needs to know your whole story to build something together. Greg handled the front. The pitch, the meetings, the name. He chose AeroCL. I set up the back-end wiring, circuit paths, thermal seals. Long nights blinking at whiteboards. The idea was simple. A coating that adapts to cold, weather surfaces. Reduce energy loss. Lower heating bills. We tested in an old barn out in Payson. Borrowed a thermal gun from a retired engineer I met on a forum. I stayed behind the scenes. That's how I liked it. Mostly. But every time we talked to early-stage investors, something shifted. Greg always stood in the light. I stayed in the hallway, holding the charts. One afternoon, he emailed me the first pitch deck update. Subject. Final version in. My name wasn't on slide 2 anymore. I didn't say anything. Just added a sticky note inside the folder. So, founder. Still here. He never replied. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he forgot. Back then, I still gave him the benefit of the doubt. The first time I noticed my login didn't work, I thought it was a glitch. New security system. New IT contractor. Greg said they were tightening permissions. I smiled. Sure, I said. But the weight in my chest didn't budge. He changed the shared folder names too. What used to be AEROGWG 2021 became AEROD Central. No initials, no trace. I brought it up once, half joking over dinner. "You're kinda scrubbing me from the files, huh?" I smiled when I said it. Meant it to sound light. He didn't laugh. Didn't look up from his phone. "Don't be dramatic, Janelle. It's just naming conventions." Naming conventions. That week, he held 2 meetings with early partners. No invite. No recap. I found out from an intern who asked if I could help test a version I hadn't seen. I walked into the lab, stared at the prototype. Same shape. Same circuits. My own notes still taped underneath the test board. But no one had told me they'd run it without me. Greg said it was timing. That I was hard to catch lately. I was in that office 6 days a week. I hadn't taken a real vacation in 2 years. Still, I told myself, maybe he's stressed. Maybe it's investor pressure. Maybe he's protecting me. Funny how we excuse people just to avoid seeing what's right in front of us. I printed my original schematics, kept them in a fireproof envelope in the bottom drawer. Labeled it Legacy J. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't tell him. Sometimes, you hold on to the evidence, even before you know you'll need it. Dinner used to be our reset. Late nights, takeout containers, 2 forks, talking specs over sesame noodles. Now he ate standing up, phone in one hand, glass of wine in the other. When I mentioned the new pressure seal test, he cut me off mid-sentence. "That's not your lane anymore, babe. We've got people for that. Not your lane." I stirred my soup, didn't answer. He didn't notice. At night, he stayed up late in the guest room. Just working. I stopped asking what on. He stopped asking anything at all. I remember one morning, I caught him on a video call in the garage. Didn't say who with. Just clicked the lid of his laptop fast and said, "Shouldn't you be in the lab?" My name hadn't been in the company group chat for weeks. Not tagged. Not referenced. But every blueprint in that lab still had my initials. Every baseline formula traced back to one of my trial sheets. Greg never said I was out. He just stopped letting me in. I kept showing up. Kept logging test data. Kept making tea in the tiny back kitchen that still smelled like burnt tape and cheap instant oatmeal. Some nights, I'd walk past the conference room and hear them practicing pitches. Slide after slide. Greg's voice smooth. The new junior tech nodding. My chair was still in the corner. Nobody used it. But they never moved it either. Just left it there. Like a placeholder that no longer meant anything. That night, I printed an old photo me and Greg in the first AeroCL hoodie, grinning like idiots, holding up a prototype with duct tape on the back. I pinned it inside my notebook. Private. Quiet. A reminder I was there, even if they pretended I wasn't. The invite never came. Friday's product review. I checked the calendar 3 times. Nothing. I asked Claire, the intern. "Oh, sorry," she said. "Greg told us you were traveling that week." I wasn't. I was sitting in the office next to his. He never knocked. Never asked. I opened the shared drive. Folder names changed again. Access limited. My admin rights? Gone. No warning. No explanation. I clicked into my own design archive 404. That ache started behind my ribs. The one that says, "You already know the answer, but wish you didn't." I didn't confront him. Not yet. I opened voice memo on my phone. Pressed record. Left it running in my pocket every time I walked into the office. I started printing things again. Notes, formulas, meeting logs. Stacked them in a slim black folder. Slid it under the panel beneath my desk drawer. Air Force trick. Keep your fallback where no one checks. Greg got quieter around me, but louder on calls. Need to move fast. Want clean ownership. Can't afford confusion in the cap table. He didn't say my name, but I heard the silence where it used to be. One night, I stayed late. Told him I was working on sensor recalibration. He didn't ask what for. After he left, I logged into the test server using a recovery credential. I never gave up. Downloaded every spec I had touched. Timestamps. Version history. Change logs. Printed the last one. Stared at it under the yellow desk lamp. Columns modified by value. G. Mitchell erasure. Com action removed co-founder tag. I didn't cry. Didn't breathe, really. Just stared. And whispered. Not a mistake. Not this time. I called Kim that night. Hadn't spoken in over a year. We used to share bunk beds at Fort Hood, laughing under mosquito nets, arguing over ration packs. She picked up on the second ring. Same voice. Still sharp. Carrington. Her face lit up on the screen, framed by a law office bookshelf. Hey, I said, weakly. Didn't think I'd cry this fast. She blinked. You're crying. I wiped my cheek. Didn't even notice the tear. Just one? I said. Still within regulation. She gave a short laugh, then narrowed her eyes. What's going on? I told her everything. Start to finish. The login locks. The vanished files. The words Greg said. Not your lane anymore. She didn't interrupt. Just nodded once, then said, Hayes staging ownership transfer. Probably weeks away from paperwork. You still have access to anything. Some, I said. Backdoors. Logs. Gotta dig for Dig hard, she said. But don't act yet. No accusations. Just collect. Record. Be invisible. I nodded. Kim. My voice cracked. She leaned in. Was I stupid to trust him this long? She shook her head slowly. No. But now you better trust yourself more. We ended the call after midnight. I sat in the dark kitchen, cup of cold tea untouched. The silence pressed in like the weight of winter gear I once hauled across airstrips. Same heaviness. Same focus. I opened a blank folder on my desktop. Labeled it as sus, fallout logs and encrypted it. Started moving files. Every voice memo. Every email thread. Every spec sheet I authored with time stamps and metadata. Greg still smiled at me every morning. Still kissed my cheek on Wednesdays. Still said, "You good?" Like nothing had shifted. But something had. I wasn't watching the cracks anymore. I was measuring them, preparing for collapse. I renamed the folder again. Sus-proof head, nose docs. The walls in our office weren't thick, just drywall and leftover insulation foam. Some days, I could hear Greg's phone calls, like he was sitting across from me. I started wearing earbuds. But not to block him out, to record. Tiny mic tucked in the cord. Hooked to my burner phone. Labeled it, old podcasts. Every call went to backup. Every meeting. Every hallway chat. Even the moments he thought were just silence. I captured those too. He was always louder when the door was halfway closed. Like he wanted to be heard. But only by people who wouldn't question him. On Thursday, he had a Zoom with someone from Ridgepoint Capital. Didn't close the door all the way. I paused my typing. Slid my chair back. Just enough to hear him say, "She was part of the early phase, but there's no shared equity. I'm the only founder on record." That line didn't sting. It burned, like someone had opened a hidden wound and poured something cold and acidic inside. I froze. Didn't breathe. Didn't blink. The fluorescent light above my desk buzzed louder than it had all week. Greg's voice kept going, smooth as always. "We've kept things clean. No entanglements. IP is fully under my name." Then laughter. Not the kind he gave me after we nailed our first investor meeting. This one was sharper. Crueler. They always assume the quiet ones did more. You know how it is. My hand clenched around the pen. It snapped. Ink blot onto the folder. I didn't flinch. The call ended. The silence afterward felt even louder. It settled on my shoulders like winter gear I hadn't worn since Kandahar. I stood. Walked to the far desk drawer. Pulled out my headphones, the over-ear kind. Solid, noise-canceling, reliable. Plugged them into the burner. Scrolled to the file.
Let's play sex.
I'm the only founder on record. Pause. Rewind. Again. No shared equity. Again. They always assume the quiet ones. The voice that once whispered love now whispered erasure. The man who once traced my wrist with his thumb now rubbed me out of history with the stroke of a sentence. I sat there, alone with the truth, while the office hummed like nothing had changed. But everything had. I labeled the recording, then ours primary tape. Das's slipped a printed transcript into a clean envelope. Wrote one line on the back X. You thought I'd stay quiet. Zess sealed it. Then I added another label, us sex play this, when he smiles. Greg made eggs that morning. Overcooked. Rubbery. Just how I hated them. He didn't notice. Didn't ask. We sat at opposite ends of the kitchen island, coffee going cold in identical mugs we got at the startup retreat in Tahoe. He sipped his, scrolling through emails. Still shirtless. Still humming the same tune he used to play when we pitched together. I moved the Ridgepoint slides into your shared folder. He said casually. Take a quick look before I finalize. My fork paused mid-air. I raised an eyebrow. You want my input? He chuckled. It's good to have a second set of eyes. You've always been detail-oriented. I smiled. Didn't show teeth. Wes, that's my lane. Huh. He didn't flinch. Just kept sipping. I opened the folder after breakfast. The slides were clean. Too clean. My name appeared once. Bottom corner of a slide labeled, Founding Support Team. No photo. No date. Just a bullet point. I stared at it for a long time. Like if I blinked too fast, it might vanish again. He walked past the room on a call with someone. Laughing. Said something about wrapping the narrative cleanly. Saw I didn't follow him. Didn't ask what narrative. Didn't care. Because now I knew. Greg didn't think I'd push back. Didn't think I had the stomach for it. And maybe he was right. Last year. Not anymore. Later that night. He stood behind me in the office, watching me adjust a pressure formula on the whiteboard. You still love this stuff, he said quietly. I do. He stepped closer. Placed a hand on my back. Glad we're still in this together. I nodded. Yeah. He left a second later, footsteps fading down the hall. I stared at the board for a full minute before wiping the whole thing clean. Then I opened my notebook. Blank page. Wrote one line. Less, he still underestimates me. I used to think Greg really saw me. Back in the first winter, before the money, before the meetings with men in suits, ladder and graphs with 6-digit slides. We stayed up late in that old converted garage. A space heater clicking. Our fingers raw from soldering cold circuits. I was debugging line 38 when Greg leaned against the doorframe, watching me with that soft half-smile. You know this thing only works because of you, right? He said. I laughed. You mean because of the algorithm? No, he said, stepping closer. Because of your brain. Your backbone. You're the heart of this thing, Janelle. I remember that word. Heart. Sec. It clung to me like warmth in a room full of steel. He meant it then. I know he did. There wasn't anything to gain by saying it. We were broke. Burning savings. Living off microwave pasta. Back then, he sent me voice memos at 2 a.m. excited about a breakthrough. Asking, did you run the calc again? I trust your gut. Now he calls my contributions support. Now he talks to investors about wrapping the narrative. Now my name lives in font size 9, at the bottom of a slide no one stops to read. Funny, isn't it? How love, ray, and credit, and equity can all evaporate while you're still sitting in the same chair. But I don't want the old Greg back. That version of us is gone. And I'm not begging for space in anyone's footnote. I'm not trying to rewind this story. I'm rewriting it. That night, I sat in front of our original whiteboard, the one with paint peeling off the edge and a crack near the corner from where Greg once dropped a solder gun in excitement. I took a photo of it, the faded formulas, the doodles in the margin, his initials, mine. Then I erased it all. Every line, every marker. Gone. Except one word I left in the corner. He's hurt. Sec. Underlined once. Just once was enough. Monday's team sync used to start with my notes, timeline, risk flags, build updates. Now it started with Greg's smile. "All right, folks," he said, clapping once. "Let's talk momentum." I sat 2 chairs from him, close enough to hear every beat, far enough to feel invisible. He moved through the deck like a man who never needed a partner. "Our early tech came together fast," he said. "Got us our first demo units. No names, no credits. Just R." When he hit slide 6, the pressure system breakdown, my code glowed on the screen like it belonged to someone else. Claire from Analytics raised her hand. "Did you write the efficiency mod?" Greg smiled. "It evolved over time, lots of hands on it." I didn't move. Didn't flinch. The same line I wrote at 2 a.m. after 3 failed trials d'error and a burnt-out relay. Still there. Unchanged. They moved on. I listened. Every word filed somewhere deeper now. And not in pride, but in proof. Greg never looked my way. Not once. He closed the meeting with his usual line. "Grateful for the team. Let's keep building." Everyone stood. Stretching, chatting. Claire offered me a half smile. I nodded back. As they trickled out, Greg lingered behind. He patted the table. "You okay?" I smiled. "Warm. Practiced." "Off course." He winked. "We're making good progress." "Sure are." He left with the last of them, still whistling. I stayed behind. Waited until the hallway was quiet. Then walked back to my desk. Opened the bottom drawer. Entered the passcode. The lock clicked open. Inside, a fireproof envelope, sealed tight. I slid in one more document. Transcript, dated, stamped. His words, my silence. I ran my thumb across the label. Primary tape, still there. Then I locked the drawer again. No keys left on the table. No trail. Just steel. And truth, and time. This wasn't about making noise. It was about choosing when to break the silence. The man on the other end of the call wore a faded flight jacket. Behind him, an American flag, folded sharp in a wooden case. Books stacked neatly, labels hand-written in black marker. "Ms. Carrington," he said. "We don't usually take unsolicited calls." I sat up straighter. Voice even. Tone calm. "This isn't a pitch," I said. "It's a warning." He blinked once. Didn't lean forward. Didn't lean back. Just waited. So I told him. The full story. The work. The silence. The theft. I didn't dramatize it. Didn't need to. I let the facts speak, just like I'd been trained. Dates. IP logs. Slide changes. The memo. The recordings. I didn't cry. Not once. He listened. Hands folded. Occasionally glanced at the papers I'd emailed in advance. When I finished, he cleared his throat. Then tapped a yellow notepad beside him. "Your name's not on the deal paperwork," he said. "No. Publicly? Only in archived filings." He scrubbed everything after seed round. He nodded. Then looked up. "We can't interfere based on feelings," he said. "But we don't ignore facts." Behind him, another man entered the frame. Older, sharp eyes, silver hair, clean cut. "Carrington," he said. "Logistics unit, Fort Hood." I blinked. "Yes." He smiled. Not soft, not warm. But familiar. "Good," he said. "Then you understand what I'm about to say." I waited. You do not engage directly. You do not confront. You prepare. And when the moment comes, you do not hesitate. My breath caught. Not from fear. From recognition. Yes, sir. They gave me a direct contact. Encrypted line. Single, use code. They'd monitor Ridgepoint's next move from the back end. But the trigger, that had to come from me. After the call ended, I sat alone in the dark office. Only the screen glowed. The city outside was quiet. Even the hum of the fridge felt distant. I stared at the desktop folder labeled Fallout Logs. One click, and the trap would spring. But not yet. Greg needed to walk himself right into it. He needed to sign. Smile. Shake hands. Speak lies loud and clear. While the tape played in waiting, I wasn't going to stop him. I was going to let him finish the sentence. And press play when he said, "Thank you." Kim called just before sunrise. She didn't ask if I slept. We both knew the answer. "You good?" she asked. I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "Everything's in place." "You still planning to let him speak first?" "Yeah," I said. "He's gonna walk himself into it. I just need him to say one wrong word. Just one." Kim leaned forward, her voice low. "Then don't flinch. Not when he lies. Not when they look at you. Not when the room goes quiet. I won't." We paused. She tapped her pen on something off screen. "Backups. 3 locations," I said. "One with you. One encrypted on external. One mailed to a third-party lockbox with my name and timestamp." "Good." I took a slow breath. My stomach was a knot of cold wire, but my hands stayed steady. After we hung up, I opened the kitchen cabinet. The one Greg never looked in. Inside a small black folder, a second burner phone, and a sealed envelope marked "Hers, in case of spin." I opened the file. Everything was there. The voice memo, the metadata, the full transcript aside, by side comparison of original vs. modified slides. I checked the timestamps again. Everything aligned. I zipped the folder and renamed it Assess, Record as Zeroed Locked. Then I emailed it to myself under an old Air Force alias. One no one knew still worked. I watched the upload bar crawl forward. A green line moving like breath held too long. When it hit 100%, I finally leaned back. The room around me was silent. Not peaceful. Just precise. Greg still thought the meeting would be his victory lap. He didn't know there were other eyes watching now. Other hands ready to pull the plug. He thought this was the end of a deal. He didn't know it was the beginning of exposure. Later that afternoon, I stood in front of the mirror. The one by the office restroom, with a crack across the lower right corner. I straightened my collar. Navy blue blouse. Pressed. Simple. Same one I wore the day I received my logistics commendation from Colonel Rees. Same stance. Chin high. Hand still. I looked myself in the eye and said, quietly, "You're not walking into a trap. You're walking into a reckoning." Then I picked up the flash drive, slipped it into my blazer pocket, and walked out the door like I belonged in every room. He erased me from. The conference room smelled like new paint and old confidence. White walls. Polished table. Coffee steaming in branded cups. Ridgepoint logos on crisp folders. Greg was already there. Navy blazer, white shirt, no tie. His relatable CEO look. He laughed easily, shoulders relaxed, as if this was just another lap in a race he'd already won. "Janelle," he said, turning, voice warm, practiced. "Glad you could make it." I smiled. Nodded. Wouldn't miss it. He pulled out a chair near the end of the table. Not beside him, not near the investors, but tucked slightly off-center. Safe. Distant, I sat. Didn't adjust my blouse. Didn't cross my arms. I just watched. He poured me coffee as if that could smooth years of erasure. "Thanks," I said, voice even. Took a sip. Bitter. Too hot. Perfect. One of the Ridgepoint partners glanced my way. I gave a polite nod. She nodded back. Curious, but silent. I didn't speak. Didn't offer a handshake. Didn't rush. The silence made Greg a little fidgety. He cleared his throat, flipped open his tablet. "We'll keep this quick," he said. "Just a few key highlights." I glanced at the wall clock. It ticked with steady certainty. Everything in the room felt like it belonged in a pitch deck. Clean. Curated. Controlled. Except me. I didn't belong in that room anymore, not the way Greg saw it. But I was there. I was present. And that was enough. He dimmed the lights, walked to the screen. Remote in hand. Slide 1. Logo, tagline, projected value, he smiled. Click. Slide 2. The story behind the solution. He glanced around. "Before we dive into numbers," he said, "I want to talk about where this started. Where we started." He looked right at me. And I let him. Didn't nod. Didn't blink. I just watched as the screen flickered. Bah. And the story he thought he owned began to unravel. Greg clicked to the next slide. "Year 1 was scrappy," he said. "We were piecing together hardware in a garage, just two people with a vision." He didn't say our names. Not mine. Not his. Just two people. Like one of us had already been blurred out. He paced slowly, fingers curled around the remote. "We ran tests in below zero temps, built 5 prototypes, logged nearly 300 hours of failure. Before we hit on something stable." He smiled at the table. "I remember soldering components with gloves on. Could barely hold the wires steady. I did that." He watched. The room chuckled politely. Investors nodded. Except one. The woman across from me. Dark blazer, no jewelry, pen poised, but still. She didn't laugh. She looked straight at me, not long. Just a second too long. She knew something was off. Greg kept going. He talked about early grants. First phase assembly. Our lucky break. No mention of who secured the Defense Energy Pilot Fund. No mention of who wrote the grant narrative at 3 a.m. after 2 nights sleeping under her desk. And cold tea going sour beside the printer. He moved to slide 5. Timeline. Each milestone a dot. Each dot a name. None were mine. Claire, Ben, Jamal. Even interns listed as key contributors. I watched my absence stretch across 3 years of work. A timeline scrubbed clean. Greg turned again. "And that brings us to now. Our Series A." He leaned on the edge of the table, the way he always did when closing strong. "It's been a long road. But the foundation is solid. Our team's lean, disciplined, and built for scale." The woman in the dark blazer spoke. "Can I ask, who handled most of the technical build-out in those early months?" Greg hesitated. Just a breath. Then, "It was collaborative, a mix of ideas and grit. I led most of the system design directly." Her eyes didn't move. I didn't speak. Didn't smile. Didn't blink. Just let the weight settle. The silence between his sentence "Wow" and her raised brow was sharper than any question. Greg clicked again. Next slide. Projections. But the air had shifted. He didn't know it yet. But someone else in that room had started listening to the part he didn't say. Greg moved into the final segment. IP structure. He pulled up a clean chart. Boxes and arrows, ownership buckets, equity splits. His name sat at the top of the flowchart. Alone. No mention of joint filings. No footnotes. Just Greg. He tapped the screen. "All proprietary systems fall under one entity, Aerosale Core." He paused. "My entity." That was the slip. Too bold. Too direct. The woman in the dark blazer shifted slightly. Her pen touched the page but didn't write. She glanced toward me again. Then back at the chart. Greg caught it. He smiled. Polished. Rehearsed. "To clarify," he added, "there was contribution in the early phase, but the IP itself was consolidated cleanly under my lead before filing." I let that sit. Didn't shift. Didn't breathe loud. He was walking himself into it, word by word. Each sentence another inch deeper. Across the table, someone cleared their throat. It wasn't a cough. It was the sound of someone starting to doubt. Greg moved faster after that. More graphs. More forecasts. Bigger numbers. But the pitch had lost its rhythm. Even his voice knew it. A small ripple had started. And I didn't need to make a sound to push it further. I looked down at my notepad. Blank. I hadn't written a single word. Didn't need to. Everything I needed was already recorded. I glanced toward the door. Kim would be outside by now, ready to cue the team if I gave the signal. I touched my blazer pocket. Felt the slight curve with the flash drive. The one with the file labeled, "Play first." I wasn't nervous. Not anymore. Greg had handed me the stage. He just didn't know it yet. And when the last lie landed, I'd be ready to let the truth speak for itself. Greg smiled like a man who'd just crossed the finish line. The projector dimmed behind him. The deal memo sat printed on the table, pages thick with promises. He turned toward the investors, pen in hand. "I'd be honored," he said, "if Ridgepoint would take this step with us." The lead partner reached forward. Fingers touched the pen. I stood. Not fast. Not dramatic, just enough to interrupt the air. Every eye turned. Even Greg froze. I stepped around the table, quiet heels over carpet, until I reached the projector. He spoke first. "Janelle." His voice was careful now. Measured. I met his gaze. Held it. "I have one more slide to show," I said. Greg blinked. "No's not the time." "It's exactly the time." I pulled the flash drive from my pocket. Slid it into the port. The projector flickered. Black screen. Then white. Then sound. It was his voice, clear. Unmistakable. "We'll remove her after the deal. She doesn't matter anymore. IP's mine. No one needs to know." Silence. Total. Full. Stifling. Greg stepped back, face pale. "I don't. That's taken out of." I turned toward the table. "My name's not on the slides," I said. "Not in the filings. Not in the story he's told." I paused. "But I'm in the work. Every design. Every test log. Every ounce of the product you're here to fund." No one moved. No one blinked. The woman in the dark blazer looked at me. Not with surprise, but recognition. Greg stammered, "She's bitter. This is a personal." I cut in. "I have the timestamps. Emails. Voice. Line by line." I tapped the keyboard. A second clip played. "Don't worry. She won't fight it. She still thinks I love her." The last sentence hung in the air like smoke. Nobody looked at Greg. Not anymore. No one rushed to speak. The silence had a weight to it now. Not shock, but calculation. The kind that comes right before a decision changes direction. I didn't sit back down. Instead, I reached into my folder and laid a stack of documents on the table. Stapled, dated, organized. Email threads, change logs, file authorship metadata, voice memos, all time-stamped, all intact. Greg didn't look at the stack. He looked at me. Eyes narrow, jaw clenched. "This is petty," he said, voice tight. "You're trying to tank years of work because you didn't get enough spotlight." I didn't answer. He turned to the investors. "She's been distant for months. Stopped contributing. Fell out of sync. This is just bitterness, that's all." Still, I said nothing. I didn't need to. The woman in the blazer picked up the top page. Her eyes moved fast, but her hand stayed steady. "This line," she said, "shows the IP filing was adjusted post-review. Is that correct?" Greg hesitated. "It was cleaned for simplicity." She raised an eyebrow. "Cleaned." He shifted. "Streamlined," he said. Another investor cleared his throat. "Maybe we should pause. Just for clarity." Greg opened his mouth. But nothing came out. I finally sat down. My hands didn't shake. I folded them neatly over the folder. Looked across the table. Waited. Greg broke first. "She's making this personal." The lead partner spoke. "It became personal the moment you erased her name and thought no one would check." Greg tried to laugh. That hollow, thin kind that doesn't reach the eyes. But no one else joined in. The pitch was over. The smile had cracked. And the room wasn't his anymore. The lead partner glanced at Greg. "Would like to speak with Miss Carrington privately," he said. "Just for fairness." Greg scoffed. "I've told you everything you need to know." "Then you won't mind stepping out," the woman in the dark blazer said. Her tone wasn't angry, just final. Greg stood slowly, lips pressed tight. His gaze landed on me. For once, without charm, he walked out without another word. The door clicked shut behind him. I didn't move. Didn't shift my posture. The heat in my chest had cooled. The woman turned to me. "Would you be willing to walk us through your version?" I nodded once. "Yes, but only if you want the real one." She gestured gently. "We're listening." I took a breath. Not to steady myself. I didn't need that anymore. Just to give space for the weight of this moment. "I built the first system prototype in the back of a barn outside Payson," I said. Greg brought the first pitch deck. I wrote the specs, sourced the seals, calibrated the temperature thresholds. They said nothing. So I kept going. We worked side by side, until there was funding on the table. That's when the credits got vague, the logins changed, and my name shrank until it disappeared. I tapped the folder again. I documented it all. Not to take him down, but to prove I was ever there. The man across the table leaned in slightly. "Why now?" My fingers brushed the edge of the printout. "Because silence isn't the same as agreement. And I'm not going to let the last thing people hear about my work be someone else's version." They sat with that for a beat. Then one of them said softly, "Do you have the original architecture draft?" I nodded. "It's in the drive." Unedited. With every change since. The woman in the blazer folded her hands. "We'll need time to review. But thank you, Miss Carrington." "For what?" "For coming back to the room you were never supposed to leave." Outside the glass wall, Greg paced with his hands in his pockets. But inside, the story had changed hands. The next morning, I walked back into the same room, same chairs, same lights, different air, no projector this time. Just a folder in the center of the table and a pot of untouched coffee. Greg was already seated. He didn't look at me. Didn't nod. His hands stayed folded, knuckles white against the edge of the wood. I didn't sit where I had yesterday. I took the chair across from him. Even distance. The Ridgepoint team entered. Composed. Measured. The woman in the dark blazer carried a red file. She didn't sit. She stood behind her chair, rested her fingertips on the backrest, and opened the file. "We've reviewed the materials submitted," she began, including timestamps, IP chain of custody, and full design logs dated prior to series a draft. She didn't glance at Greg. "Effective immediately, Ridgepoint is pausing all agreements pending external legal review. No funds will be transferred. All documents related to company ownership and contribution will be re-examined by our counsel." Greg shifted in his chair. Still didn't speak. "We are not making accusations today," she said. "We are enforcing accountability." Someone exhaled softly. Might have been me, might have been Greg. I didn't flinch. I just nodded once. "Understood." The man beside her added, "I'd also like to speak directly with your legal representative, Ms. Carrington. And if you're willing, review early phase grant documentation." I'm willing, I said. It was quiet again. But not the same kind of quiet. Not suspicion. Not erasure. This was a quiet that watched. That weighed. The woman closed the file. That's all for today. Greg stood. His eyes brushed mine for the first time in hours. But he didn't speak. Didn't explain. Didn't defend. He just walked out. Fast. Almost careful not to let the door slam behind him. I stayed seated. Just a little longer. Because for once, no one asked me to leave. The wind had picked up by the time I reached the parking lot. Dry. Cool. Utah spring. Half winter, half sun. Kim leaned against her car, a black folder tucked under her arm. No smile. Just presence. I walked up slow. No rush left in me. She handed me the folder. Straight from Ridgepoint's legal desk, she said. Signed. Stamped. They want you at the table. I didn't open it. Not yet. Just held it with both hands, as if it weighed more than paper. What's the angle? I asked. No angle, Kim said. Not this time. They're not asking you to relive it. Just to walk in as who you always were. I let that settle. So much of the past 3 years had been about proving, recording, defending. And now, they were just asking me to be present. We stood in silence for a moment, traffic low, birds loud. I looked down at my own name on the envelope. Typed clean, no parentheses, no title. Just Janelle Carrington's. It looked right. I thought I'd feel more angry, I said. More vindicated. Kim shook her head. Sometimes justice doesn't feel like a punch. It feels like being able to breathe. I nodded. She was right. We hugged. Brief, firm, quiet. Then she opened her car door. Paused. You know, she said. The best part isn't that they heard you. What is it then? That you didn't disappear while waiting. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. She drove off, taillights blinking against the mountain sky. I stood there a while longer, folder in hand, not trying to plan the next move. Just feeling the ground beneath me, solid, undeniable. No podium, no press release, no applause. But something in the air whispered, this time you get to write the headline. A week later, the room felt different. Same glass walls. Same sterile air, but this time my chair wasn't near the edge. It was dead center, set deliberately. Not symbolic, just correct. I arrived 10 minutes early. Habit. The receptionist nodded. Ms. Carrington, they're ready when you are. I walked in with a single folder and my laptop. No briefcase, no performance. Inside, the table was already full. Legal counsel. 2 Ridgepoint partners. 3 department leads. No Greg. His name wasn't on the agenda. It wasn't on the whiteboard either. I didn't ask. Didn't need to. They all stood as I entered. Not theatrically, just in acknowledgement. I took my seat. Right where the founding CEO usually sat. Only now they weren't calling it that. Just technical lead, strategic co-founder, clear, accurate. The woman in the dark blazer gave me a slight nod. Ms. Carrington, would you be comfortable leading the tech roadmap discussion? I opened my laptop. Fingers steady. Voice even. Yes. Let's start with version 3's adaptive cycle thresholds. They'll dictate most of our next phase durability claims. No one interrupted. No one rephrased what I said. No one tried to clarify on my behalf. They just listened. I clicked to the first chart. Then the second. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even redemption. It was restoration. Each line of data was mine. Built in silence, refined in doubt, presented without apology. 15 minutes in, someone leaned back and said, "This changes how we frame the rollout." Another added, "Why may need to revisit the messaging, shift it to reflect actual authorship." I didn't respond. I let them adjust to the truth the way I had, quietly, permanently. The meeting ended with an agreement to restructure founder credits, revise internal titles, and revisit patent signatories. No one said Greg's name. No one had to. When I walked out, no applause followed. No spotlight. Just the click of the door behind me and the sound of my own heels on polished floor. And for the first time in a long time, every step I took sounded exactly like mine. 1 month later, the name on the door wasn't mine. But that was the point. It said, OS Prototype Lab Carrington Group. Inside, the space smelled like fresh wires and solder smoke. New hands. New minds. No glass walls, no corner offices. Just benches, sketch pads, coffee mugs with chipped rims. The youngest on the team, Marcus, barely 26, was tweaking a seal alignment. Too tight, I said softly. He looked up, grinned. Knew you were watching. Always. He didn't flinch when I corrected him. Didn't get defensive. That was something I'd insisted on early. Feedback wasn't criticism. It was survival. Across the room, Lena ran heat response simulations. She'd joined 2 weeks ago. No degree. Just instinct and 5 years rebuilding HVAC systems with her father in Michigan. I liked her. She didn't pretend. She didn't ask to be taught. She just watched. Then tried. And that was enough. Most days, I didn't speak unless they asked. Not because I was quiet, but because now, I didn't need to be loud to be heard. At the far wall hung our working board. White lacquer, magnetic strips, notes in red and green. I walked over, sipped lukewarm tea from a steel tumbler, eyes scanning thermal curves and stress diagrams. There, top right corner. Version 3.5 heater assembly, lead. Blank. Not erased, just left open. I stared at the line. That space, so familiar. Once, my name had been removed from places like that without warning. Now, no one dared to write it for me. And no one tried to leave it out, either. I picked up the marker. Paused. Not for drama. Just for breath. Then I wrote, in clean black ink. Cellited, J. Carrington, simple, small, permanent. Behind me, Marcus gave a small nod. Said nothing. Kept working. Lena didn't even look up. They weren't surprised. That's how I knew it was real. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't restitution. This was legacy, built not from noise, but from what remained after everything else fell quiet. That night, the lab was quiet. Everyone gone. Just me, the hum of standby monitors, and the soft clink of ceramic against steel as I washed my mug. I didn't leave. Didn't rush home. Didn't check my phone. I just sat, back against the edge of the workbench, light low, air still. And finally, after weeks of holding back, I opened the folder labeled primary tape. I plugged in the flash drive, the old one. Familiar weight in my hand. Worn edges. One file, same name. Errors hit thing stud want fight. WAV. I clicked play. Greg's voice filled the room. Low. Confident. Careless. We'll remove her after the deal. She doesn't matter anymore. I let it play to the end. Not because I needed to. Because I chose to. I listened not to remember him, but to remember me. The woman who heard those words and didn't break. Didn't beg. Didn't disappear. Just moved forward. When it ended, I didn't flinch. Didn't rewind. I dragged the file to trash, hit delete. The screen flashed once. Then empty. Not because I'd forgiven him. Not even close. But because I didn't need that voice anymore to prove I was real. On the worktable, a thin envelope rested under a data cable. I opened it. Typed on ivory paper, Va's invitation to speak at Founders, Who Reclaimed Their Name panel discussion, Austin Tech Forum. I smiled. Tired. Wry. Not rejection. Not acceptance. Just the awareness that I could say yes or no on my own terms. No permissions. No politics. No need to ask if I deserved to be there. The silence in the room didn't press this time. It opened. Made space. I closed the envelope, slipped it back where it was. Then pulled my notebook from my bag. Last page. Corner torn. Tea stain on the edge. I didn't plan the sentence. Didn't rehearse it. Just wrote. Was. You don't have to raise your voice when you've built your name strong enough to stand. Sus. Then I set the pen down, closed the book, and walked out into the night. Not as a shadow of what was taken, but as the shape of everything reclaimed,